Hello everybody, my name is Wasim and we are going to take a weird and short journey through something that I've been calling epistemporalism. So I'm going to show you a few slides that I prepared for the recent 0x Salon event, A Better Living Through Abstraction, where I promised very grandly to cover 5,000 years of epistemology in 5 minutes. And obviously I failed, but this is kind of a partial retrospective document of what I was attempting to do. So this picture is just a pretty picture of some kind of like abstract representation of Cartesian space. So, you know, we're talking about conceptual frameworks. You may see a bit later that the reason I came across this topic to unpack it a bit more, kind of with a bit more philosophical precision and vigor, is because I was working on a series of abstract conceptual frameworks for the classification, characterization of cryptographic assets and networks. And that was a project called Token Space, which I was working on between 2017 and 2019. And there's a whole bunch of stuff that related to that online. So I'll give you two web materials. One is 0xsalon.xyz, and the other one is tokenspace.pubpub.org. Okay, so let's jump in. So I tend to always start talks by showing a slide, either of this slide or a slide like it, because it seems to me that nearly all of our problems arise from the fact that human communication is hard. We're bad at it. We're still bad at it. It's been millions of years. Humans have been trying to communicate with each other, and we still suck at this. So, you know, we're talking about the languages that we've developed. We're talking about semantics and idiosyncrasies contained within languages, layers of context that are explicit and less explicit, implicit, you know, vagaries of grammar, and you know, all of the non-verbal communication that we do. You can't really see my hands, but I'm more often using them to bolster or animate my words, and we all do that. I'm sure we've all seen information about those studies that suggests that less than 30% of your communication is actually strictly verbal, listening to the words from somebody's mouth. So let's talk about what communication is, what human communication is, right? So this all started off because we're these creatures, Homo sapiens, that use small mouth noises to communicate with each other, right? So we purse our lips, we make sounds, phonemes and what have you, and then they're cast out into the air, sound vibrations, sound waves vibrate the air, and they reach the oral input systems of any other creature, living or otherwise, that may be within earshot. So in order for us to have a conversation, there basically needs to be a set of two translations, you could say. So I have neural impulses. We still don't really know where they came from, but let's put that to one side. And then I have to encode those into small mouth noises. Then I deliver those like I'm delivering them now. And then somebody on the other side of the conversation, like, you know, in real meet space or in a virtual space, at the other end of a Skype call or a YouTube video, will hear those small mouth noises, and then they'll have to try to decode the meaning of those given the language context, and some of the other kind of, you know, the person, the utterer of the words and so on. So this is really like a double translation that has to take place before you've even really started to grok anything about what that person is trying to say to you. So we often end up with situations in all kinds of languages. Let's stick to English for the sake of convenience. There's a lot of words that sound similar but mean different things. So I've got this meme, which is just behind me on the screen, which is one of my favourite Twitter scrapings of recent times. And so this meme says a baklava wearing a balaclava while playing balalaika on black lava. And so those words are all different, and they all mean different things, very different things, as you can see from the picture. But they sound very similar. And so somebody that is not a native English speaker may trip over one or more of these words, or conflate one set of words with another, use them interchangeably without realizing they're different words, that they're individuated units of language. And so obviously linguistics is something, you know, very deep and rich. You can read more into that at your leisure. I don't know that much about that. I should know more than I do. So to come back to the point, similar words can have different meanings, and different words can have similar meanings. And so this is kind of the context within which a lot of the work that I'm interested in tends to start from, as I seem to be mixing kind of empirical analysis with more kind of epistemic conjectures. So it's very difficult not if you start tracing back the history of ideas and thought, given the way that things were recorded and passed down through Western knowledge traditions. It's very hard to avoid Aristotle. Like, it really is. I've done a number of projects where I've kind of tried to trace back the strands of thought and collections of knowledge. And I suppose there is like this kind of, let's say, attention bias that everything kind of got imported by the Greeks from further east, from the Byzantine empires, from the Ottomans, from Babylonians, Sumerians, Egyptians, and so on. And they tend to, get credited with it. And so some of the kind of Pareto dwellers on the big name list of philosophy, such as Aristotle, Plato, and Socrates, they tend to get an awful lot of credit for things which they may not completely deserve. But anyway, if you look back at Aristotle's Predicamenta, he spoke about categorizing, making buckets and bins to discreetly sort and classify objects. And so here he's trying to do substances versus non-substances, like something material and real versus something that is metaphysical or intangible, and then things that are kind of aggregated and things that are individual. So anyway, that's, Aristotle and Socrates are trying to do this. There was a movement called Essentialism back in ancient Greek days, before Christ. And one of the interesting concepts was, contained within essentialism, is that everything had its own innate essence and spiritual elixir, some concentrated crystallization of being, and that essence gave rise to the characteristics, the phenomena that arose from that. Now, it's called into debate whether Aristotle and his peers were true essentialists, in really believing literally in these things, or if they simply used those as a kind of conceptual lens with which to regard and hypothesize or theorize further, make further speculations. So anyway, let's not dwell too much on that. There's a big gap now in both in terms of what we have in terms of recorded history, but also in terms of the evolution of something that could start to resemble, let's say, practical epistemology, let's say. So Aristotle was not a very practical person, really. I guess you could say a lot of his renown comes from going around and asking the questions, abstracting rather than concretizing, as we would have said in the salon a few weeks ago. So this is a picture from Carl Linnaeus's work, and Carl Linnaeus was a Swedish botanist, zoologist, and naturalist who was active in the 1700s approximately, and he was this extremely prolific philosopher and life scientist, and he made it his business to go around and try to find ways to classify, categorize, understand similarities and differences between living things. So he wrote reams and reams, I think there's 10 or 12 volumes of his so-called Linnaean classification systems, and he's widely credited with the invention of the binomial nomenclature system of natural taxonomy, and that's where you divide things based on their kind of it's a hierarchical classification from like a kingdom and phylum and order and rank and genus and species and so on. I missed a few out there. There's 7 rankings, and so what we're most familiar with is the genus species naming system, as in Homo sapiens, Camillus sinensis, and so on, Salvia divinorum, and so on. And so Linnaeus was very much a classification powerhouse, I suppose you could say. And so a lot of flowers sprung forth, bloomed from the work of Linnaeus. And so on the left you've got something from the 18th century from Erit, who made some illustrations based on the binomial nomenclature. And in the 18th and 19th and through to the early 20th century, as the Industrial Revolution began in Western countries, or Anglo countries at first, people started to do extraction, purification, distillation of complex natural products such as coal and oil, crude oil. And the products that they derived from those, the way that they tried to differentiate and understand the interrelations of the physical chemical properties of those, was using a classification system like a dendritic tree-based hierarchical system that's very much reminiscent of Linnaeus's binomial nomenclature. So if you think about a binomial tree, it very eventually aggregates into a kind of a forest, a binomial forest. So this is in a way something, or not, so binomial is the wrong word here to use, but a dendritic forest. And these coal products are quite similar to that. And so we jump forwards a little bit more now, and I have a background in chemistry, like my PhD is in chemistry, and so I'm a very big fan of this periodic table of the elements. And one of the things I like most about it is that it manages to compress a tremendous amount of information into a fairly easily readable, easily navigable conceptual map. And this is something that's useful in a concrete sense, for knowing which things are similar to which and which aren't similar to which, and also in an abstract sense, as it allows speculations, theories, predictions of new elements, and where there might be islands of stability in the ratio between the number of protons in a nucleus, the number of neutrons in the nucleus, and so on. Excuse me. And so this periodic table that is very familiar to us, and I'm sure we all, nearly everybody that's watching this video, spent some time either at a high school or in a college or watching videos online where there was a person speaking in a lecture theatre or a classroom, and there's probably blackboards and screens and whatever, and behind them there's a periodic table just like this one. But what's interesting is, because this periodic table is a living document, so these kind of epistemological and taxonomical endeavours are iterative, so things are being discovered as we go along, and we understand, and our picture becomes more complete. So what's very interesting about that is you can kind of date the periodic table that was sitting above your head when you were in class or school or watching that video based on what's on it, because every few years or even less than that, new elements are discovered or new elements are named. So you can actually see in this one that I'm showing you in the slide now, here, these guys, these ones aren't named on here. Anonium, anonium, and anobium, and so they've later got names. So this actually dates the periodic table to a certain extent. Oh, let's use the pointer next time. That's probably a bit nicer. Okay, there we go. So, quick side note. So, as I said, I used to be a chemistry researcher, and so this is my former mentor, Professor Sir Martin Polyakov, who's widely accredited to be one of the, if not the leading connoisseur of periodic tables in the world. And so he's a research professor of chemistry, now an emeritus. He's now semi-retired at the University of Nottingham, which is where I did my bachelor's, master's, PhD and postdoc. I was very fortunate to have Martin as a mentor, and really, as a young whippersnapper starting my research career in my early 20s, to have a kind of a benign role model that had so much wisdom to pass on, and so much kind of validation and credibility and success was really amazing. So thanks, shout out to Martin. Martin is now a famous chemistry superstar, even in the unsexy field of inorganic chemistry. He has a YouTube channel called The Periodic Videos, which has 1.3 million subscribers. Last time of checking, there's a picture of me with Martin in his office, late 2018, I believe that was, and I was just finishing off the token space manuscript when I went to visit him and got a little bit of advice. Just above me you can see a bunch of ties. So Martin actually kind of started the trend of periodic table taxonomies. So he had the very first one back 20 years ago, back when I was a teenage undergraduate, and now he just gets given them. This is the kind of routine gift, and you can now buy these things absolutely everywhere. Let's look at this weird thing down here. What's that? That's well, until recently it was the smallest periodic table in the world, which is etched into one of his distinctive hairs. Now somebody's beaten this record, and I think it was etched into a grain of rice or something like that. And now there's a counter attempt by the Nottingham team and periodic videos team to take that record back by etching a yet smaller periodic table into his hair. And at the bottom left, you can see he's getting almost decapitated out of Paris by some guy who's in the news at the moment. So back to the periodic table. Now, one of the things to say, as we touched on earlier, is that the kind of matrix, status quo equilibrium matrix that the periodic table represents is kind of a phase in the evolution of this system of knowledge. And it wasn't always like that. So, let's take a trip back to the medieval ages, to the time of alchemy, of saltpeter, nitre, phlogiston, and quicksilver. And so back then, we didn't really know about, or we had theories about things like atoms, we had theories about things like electrons, but we didn't have any empirical validation, any true, rock solid, reliable evidence. We only had speculations, conjectures, partial view. I often like to say, you might have like a grainy, low dimensional representation. Your model or your map of a territory may be little more than a kind of grainy, fuzzy haze. And so a series of experiments and generations of theories and verification and validation took place to first understand the atomic theory, credited to researchers such as Rutherford and Dalton, then the structure of the nucleus, and the fact that the outer shell of an atom is almost all empty space, and then the realization that electrons, the configuration and assembly of electrons inside a molecule is responsible for almost all of the chemical reactivity and empirical properties that you see when trying to make combinations and create reactions, chemical reactions. And then people started to try and sort elements based on their similarities and their differences. So some elements would be grouped together based on how similar they would react with certain oxides or sulfur or so on. And so I think Dobereiner had the theory of triads, if I'm correct, where he tried to fit these things into packs of three. Other people had octet theories. And so you can see all these different kinds of attempts on the screen. Some of them linear, some of them kind of circular or revolutionary, let's say, rotating around, spiraling around, let's say. And so the thing that I always try to impress at this point is that it seems that there's two kind of birefringent loops going on here. That you've got reasoning based on axiomatic understanding. We're starting from the kind of building blocks of what we know to be non-controversially true. We need to build new conceptual frameworks. We need to understand build new models, lenses and frameworks with which to regard and pick apart the underlying mechanisms and phenomena that we observe. And then we need to do experiments to try to verify and validate or invalidate empirical verify and validate the experiments. Sorry about that, brain freeze. And so now let's look at a few different kinds of conceptual models, right? So I've got an interest in neuroscience, so particularly neuroscience of consciousness. And one of the very interesting areas at the moment is the work by Selim Atassoy and co-workers in France, and there's also the UCL team, Robin Carhart, Harris, David Nutt, and so on, where they're trying to look at non-ordinary states, cognitive mind states, trying to map them onto different kinds of neural signaling, firing, different ensembles in the brain, different parts, different frequencies, and so on. So what's extremely interesting about this is that there's this kind of meta brainwave pattern that they call connectome harmonics. So to understand a connectome, first let's understand what a genome is. The human genome is the collection of all the genes in the human species, the human genetic code base. Then a biome is the sum total of all of the biological information within a species. That's the kind of gut flora and surrounding ecosystem, as well as the creature itself, let's say, the host, the root. And then a connectome is almost like, from a network science perspective, you can think of it as a map of all the connectivities of all of the different nodes in a particular network. So in this case, the nodes are neurons in the brain, and this is trying to understand how they're connected together. And so connectome specific brainwave patterns are kind of resonance features, kind of like meta waves that are seen in the brain as certain stimuli arrive at the brain, or there's responses, or there's neural firings and so on. And so what's very interesting about this is that we start to see some very similar, we start to see connections between these meta correlates of consciousness in the brain and very fundamental aspects of physics like quantum mechanics, other wave-based phenomena. And so now let's take a hard right and we find ourselves in blockchain land. So blockchains are also these networks with nodes and connections, if you think about them in terms of from the node's eye view, from the view of each computer that's interacting with the network. But we can also abstract this thing out to in different ways and this kind of differential discretization, as I like to call it, helps us to tease apart some of the similarities and differences. It helps us to define some of these sticky terms that we find semantically very problematic in this kind of cryptocurrency world. Whether you're familiar with it or not doesn't really matter. Excuse me. And so on the left is this very simple pseudo stack of layers model based on the OSI networking stack model that was developed in the late part of the 20th century. And so this was originally developed by a fellow called Vitalik Buterin. That's up there, up there, up there. Oh. And I should use the pointer really. There we go. Yes, up here. And so Vitalik, in an article called 2017 article called "Meaning of Decentralization," put together this a three-pronged metastack. Call it metastack here. And so we added in the token space paper this monetary one. And what this helps to do is it helps us to make some slightly more precise statements about how things can be, and you can define things as they might exist on a particular layer on this stack. So for example, I might say that so here's a term that people like to use that is a little bit semantically muddy in this space, and that is immutability. So immutability can very roughly be thought of as the resistance to change of a particular piece of information. Some people say that religious texts are immutable because you're supposed to get your head chopped off if you alter them in some faiths or sects of faiths. So that's a kind of immutability. So if you've got many copies of a particular text, then you can arrive at some kind of immutability by rejecting copies which don't tally with the other ones. And that's actually quite similar to how blockchains work. Right, so all the computers are checking to make sure everybody's got the same information, the same a transaction history of the network. And if people don't have that, then alarm bells go off and people start to understand, check to see if everybody's playing by the rules. And so, for example, here you might say that immutability, this resistance to change, is primarily a protocol layer phenomenon, where it's very hard to change the protocol. You could also say it's logical, on the logical layer, on the data structure layer, where it's very hard to tamper with an append-only data structure. You could say that monetary decentralization is related to Gini coefficients, like a monetary distribution of tokens or of bank balances and so on. And so you can use these stacks of layers to help you try to make definitions where without a particular lens or conceptual tool it can be tricky or problematic or controversial. And so if you continue down this line of thought, you can go abstracto ad absurdum, as I like to say, and you can arrive at something that I call the ontological metastack, where we kind of we're zooming all the way out to make everything, all of knowledge, a stack of layers. And so you can't quite see here, but it says natural philosophy down here at the bottom. So in my opinion, this is kind of like the let me get out of the way, yeah, pre-individuated thought. This is like, back in Socrates and Aristotle's days, they were all natural philosophers, and that's all they really did, just thought about things. There weren't really any disciplines or experts or kind of discretization of fields of knowledge. Everything was just thought and stuff. And I'd say from there, another thing that's, this we move up the stack, we move up in terms of specialization or complexity. So as we come to mathematics, you could also argue that mathematics, logic are derivatives of philosophy, kind of outgrowths of philosophy. And so you could say that mathematics is a numerical system for understanding the universe and the phenomena that occur around it. It seems to be phenomenally successful given the several thousand years of data we've got on that. And so as you can then move up the stack towards physics, chemistry, life cycles, and life sciences, social sciences, and complex systems. And as you do that, the systems you're regarding become more complicated. You go from numbers and strings to atoms, molecules, organisms, and then collections of organisms, and then the meta understanding of the collections of organisms. And so what might await us after complexity science, for example? What other meta disciplines are going to be able to kind of integrate all of these, the inputs and learnings from these things, and move us forwards? So that's one to watch out for in the future. We'll see where we get to. And so I'm just going to segue into some of the work around the token space project, where I was looking at kind of how not to taxonomy. And so the word taxonomy is actually kind of a bit of a semantically vague and poorly defined one in a general sense as well. And so I'll come on to a bit later about why a lot of the so-called taxonomy work that's been done in the cryptocurrency world doesn't really stand up to deserve the name. And there's a picture of Plato's cave right behind me, and there's a reason for that, which should probably become quite clear. So taxonomies need to be more than simple sorting, simple classification, naive classification. And the example I like to use here, the kind of IRL real world example I like to use here is laundry. So we all need to do laundry. We have some clothes, they're not clean, now we need to clean them. And so once you've cleaned your clothes, you've got a big pile of clothes. And then you sort all of your clothes out, the jumpers and the socks and the trousers and the scarves. But what did you learn? What did you learn about the ontology of the sock, my friend? You did not learn much about the sock at all. So you've just sorted, but you haven't understood. So this is like descriptive endeavor without accompanying step forwards in understanding. You've not really moved the needle at all, even in an epistemic sense, let alone an ontological sense. So excuse me, yes, I just choked on my own breath there because I remembered some of the upcoming examples of slides. Oh, look, what's that on the left? It's a caveman with a piece of extremely advanced alien technology that doesn't understand how to use. Wonder why I put that there. This is also another great example of how not to taxonomy. This person was even brave enough to call this whatever this is, a periodic table of cryptocurrencies. So I see absolutely no resemblance to a periodic table of cryptocurrencies. What I do see is something that's very arbitrarily drawn scatterplot with mistakes on the axes and all kinds of stuff there. So the only thing I really like about this is the coin toss in the middle, and I think actually coin toss is quite a good way to describe this particular attempt. And so yes, the problem really is that the term taxonomy is used so loosely at the moment that you could almost call it like a tax washing or tax-plaining, where people like to build something that looks like a taxonomy, has the feel of a taxonomy, maybe it's even got some descriptive properties, characteristics, but you're probably not going to learn much from it. So naive descriptivism is not enough. And so I've done a lot of my taxonomy-based work based on this paper by Nickerson et al. 2013, Method for Taxonomy Development and its Application in Information Systems. Now this is an amazing paper. What it provides is a generalized framework with which to build taxonomies. So you can, basically they give you a big machine, a big kind of process-based machine, and you just throw in your domain objects after kind of tuning and designing this thing carefully, and then you can iterate your way to finding a kind of a useful taxonomy. So the idea being that using this kind of it's like a parsimonious definition of a taxonomy, that it's a set of n dimensions consisting of a series of mutually exclusive meta characteristics, which and each dimension equates to one characteristic, and then there's an overarching meta characteristic, which is kind of the reason why you're doing the taxonomy in the first place. And so some of the things you should really think about are how you arrive at the characteristics, the things that you're using to discriminate the objects in your domain. You can do this empirically, you can do this through elicitation, you can ask experts, you can just figure it out yourself, you can do it in an ad hoc sense. But one of the reasons, one of the goals is really to, for like parsimony. The idea is that you're trying to minimize, trying to make this thing as simple as possible with the maximum discriminatory power, explanatory power as possible. So you're trying to minimize arbitrary ad hoc dimensions. You're trying to strip away the aspects of the taxonomy or the classification system that you don't particularly need. So you may have 50 different discriminants, but if you only need 10 of them to sufficiently classify the objects, the existing set of objects that you wish your scope to cover, then maybe you've got 40 too many. So it's always simpler is better, because the simpler it is, the easier it will be to implement. And if it's too hard to implement, people will make mistakes or they'll give up, and then this thing isn't useful anymore. So you also have to consider the domain knowledge of the researcher, right? If you make this thing too hard to apply, or you give computer scientists information that operations researchers in a business school would be familiar with, then you may also struggle. So one of the biggest challenges I found with doing this kind of multidisciplinary conceptual framework research was to try and find ways that you can keep everything legible, from people from very technical fields through to people from very different areas. And so I suppose it's hard to know how well I've straddled that divide, but I am. The reason I'm recording this video is because I'm about to record a video for a graduate law school class in America who are writing a paper on this token space work, and I have absolutely no background or familiarity with law at all, but perhaps this thing is sufficiently generalizable that people from different backgrounds can kind of reach in and grab something and develop it further and work with it as they need to. And so that's why it needs to be easy, it needs to be relatively quick to apply, and it needs to be useful, actually useful. That is the most important thing. So if it's not useful, then you're just abstracting without concretizing. Congratulations. So how do you know when you arrive at the end of one of these taxonomies, when you reach the completion of this iterative process? And so Nickerson and co. Developed this very nice flowchart, which you can follow depending on whether you start from empirical bases for your set of characteristics and you work conceptually with that, or you start from conceptual and then you work empirically with that. So that's totally up to the researcher how they apply that. But so four of the most important aspects as they determine them are, it needs to be concise, as we said before, no arbitrary ad hoc dimensions, no spurious components. It needs to be robust, so it needs to withstand the field developing, the field changing, and also new objects being discovered and tried to be integrated into this taxonomy. That's why you need to be able to iterate this thing, because if a new class of objects arrives and your system doesn't hold up to it, then your system needs to evolve, or it's no longer fit for purpose, or it needs to be respecified with a narrower zone of focus or something like that. It needs to be comprehensive, so you need to be able to put any of the objects in question within scope of the epistemic framework. It needs to be able to help you with all of those. If it doesn't classify, characterize, or otherwise describe or explain some subset of the objects in your domain, then this is not an exhaustive process. You need to actually go back and develop this thing a bit more. And most importantly, or one of the most important things, is that it requires explanatory power. We need to go beyond naive descriptivism. We need something that's actually useful, and the way it becomes useful is by explaining things, understanding the nature of things, similarity and differences of things, or helping us take a view, use it as a lens with which to tease apart some nuances or some intricacies which were hitherto hidden or difficult to resolve. Okay, so I spoke very poorly of research that I consider to be bad attempts at taxonomies in this space, but it's good to know that some good ones have also started appearing. So as I was in the final stages of preparing the token space work in 2018, Gilbert Fridgen et al. Released Don't Slip on the ICO, which is a Nickerson taxonomy framework based study of different token sales. And so they managed to do some categorical analysis, and they found roughly four populations, four different kind of groups or kinds or presets or whatever families of types of token sales. And that's interesting because then you're starting to kind of parameterize and discretize a space that these objects inhabit, and that's important for the reasons that we'll come to right now as I introduce the token space project a little bit more concretely. And just to say that right here, there's a link to, actually there's a newer link, tokenspace.pubpub.org, but tokenspace.pllel.com also still works. And there's a full manuscript and a bunch of talks, including this one will probably go up there as well. So lots of resources there, everything from 5-minute TLDRs to 22,000 word manuscripts with which to unpick and view this stuff. So at its very simplest, an instantiation of a token space is shown in the slide behind me, a schematic, kind of idealized representation of that. So a token space you can think of as an n-dimensional idealized space. In this case, I've used 3 dimensions for obvious reasons, because we work in 3 dimensions with time, come to time later. And so each of these axes is scored from 0 to 1 based on a weighted formula that is arrived at from the outcomes of a taxonomy built using the Nickerson framework. Each of these dimensions, each of these axes had a taxonomy built from them. And the S at the top is for securityness, how security-like an asset is. The C is for commodityness, how commodity-like a particular asset is. And M is for moneyness, how money-like a particular commodity is. I may have got some of those mixed up. I should say them again. S is for securityness, a measure of how security-like, how much like a securitized asset a particular object is, particular cryptocurrency is. C is for commodityness, how commodity-like a particular asset is. And M is for moneyness, how money-like, how much does the object have the characteristics of a money or resemble the characteristics of a money. And so, why 3 dimensions? Well, yes, as I said, we're 3-dimensional creatures, and despite what the flat earthers think, I think we all mostly seem to value the 3 spatial dimensions. Like if you're a super string theoretician or an M-theory theoretician, you might say differently. You might say 11 dimensions knows best. But right now, let's keep it simple, and we'll stick to our 3-dimensional spatiotemporal framing of reality. More dimensions are possibly available. So this is a very boring slide taken from the manuscript, where I was it's like a la carte menu, where I was trying to develop the different possible characteristics, going from everything from Lindy effects, realness in the kind of Baudrillard simulacra sense, how easy is it to run a node, how acceptable is the token as a payment method, what's the purpose of the asset, how liquid are the markets, how functional is the network, how is their governance, and so on. And so if you want to go deeper into this, there's quite a lot of material based on token space online. As I said, this link, that link is a reasonable place to start. So this is a close-up of the securityness taxonomy, just a part of it. And so what you can see here is different categories, or the different dimensions as they're known in Nickerson parlance. Different characteristics, these mutually exclusive categories within which something has to fall, and then the numbers beside them were kind of like the weighting mechanism that I developed ad hoc or even post hoc to find a way to squash all of this information. So what you're really doing here with token space is you're engaging in this dimensional reduction. You're taking all of this information from these networks, tokens, and all the rest of it, and the kind of meta layer, social layer, and economic layers around that. And you're trying to squash all this information into a single number that you can plot on a chart. And that's very similar to what price does, right? You look at a price chart, whether it's oil or Bitcoin or frozen orange juice, doesn't really matter. The oil chart is quite fun to look at the moment if you want to have a laugh, given that the Russians and the Saudis are in a price war. Looks like that chart is even worse looking than most of the cryptocurrency charts at the moment. So price takes lots of subjective and objective factors, measures and inputs, and squashes them down into a price, right? What's the price? It's just the number at which the last transaction happened in a market. What's a market? A market is basically just a conversation between buyers and sellers, and they meet in the middle where the transaction occurs. And so the price of the price that a good is transacted at between a buyer and seller is this kind of intersubjective factors determined in the moment by all these different parameters and factors, and it's very hard to kind of know those unless you're in that particular context and situation at the time. So one of the other things I always like to make the point of with the token space work is based on what you choose from your kind of a la carte menu of potential characteristics, what you put in and how you score that in the taxonomy determines where you live on this plane, this subjective objective plane. So token space is in here. It's on the quantitative side, but you can either go very subjective or very objective depending on what you do. Now, you might say, hey, Wasim, subjectivity sucks. Let's be objective. We're all grown-up scientists here. I thought you were a scientist. Why aren't you doing things objectively? And the reason that you can't do everything totally objectively is because of this thing that economists in particular like to call Goodhart's law. And so Goodhart's law is where we, you simply put, we might say, once a measure becomes once a characteristic becomes a measure, then it ceases to be a good metric because it will be optimized for and the system will be gamed. And so the more objective your system, the more likely and susceptible it is to this Goodhart manipulability. So a good example of that is the number of nodes on a network can sometimes be taken as a proxy heuristic for how decentralized it is. And the level of decentralization in a network seems to map onto how legal or regulatorily compliant a particular network or asset or the team behind these networks and assets might have been in the creation and the stewarding of those in the early days. And so you have this kind of funny situation where say somebody from the financial regulator from the country of Extremistan says that 10,000 nodes on your cryptocurrency network means it's sufficiently decentralized and it's legal, it's not security, it's compliant. So I can get on the phone, I call up Jeff Bezos and I'll say, yo Jeff, I need 10,000 nodes right now, 10,000 nodes for my shitcoin right now. And so now I've got 10,000 nodes, I'm sufficiently decentralized, I don't go to jail. So that's an obvious mockery of the idea of having a completely objective, numerical, empirical set of benchmarks with which to realistically gauge the nature of these things. And of course, if you move too much to the subjective side, that's just your opinion, right? So this is then you lose reproducibility, falsifiability, you're susceptible to all kinds of known and unknown biases. I mean, we're just bags of meat and water. We think and feel things, and there are some biases that we have that we're aware of, and there's some biases that we're not aware of. And so, you know, if we dwell too far, if we go too far, slip down too far into the subjective world, we're back in the swamp again. It's just what he said and she said and you said and I said. So this is one of my favorite slides. I put it in almost every talk. So back to this tension between subjectivity and objectivity. Is the problem computers or is the problem humans using computers? Because I usually see like a lot of things with a thin veneer of objectivity presented as completely, you know, objective and virtuous. When in reality, you know, the number of human bias filters that have gone into constructing that objective framework render it rather meaningless. And one of the great examples of this in the present day is the obsession with machine learning and artificial intelligence. And so really this is just kind of like weaponized statistics on fast computers, iterating and looping and solving and doing whatever with different kinds of algorithms, random forests and neural nets and whatever. But if you have an objective that you're trying to reach, and you have a bunch of like complicated stuff that you're just mixing around, then like you don't really know if what you're doing is kind of rigorous and correct and falsifiable, reproducible and validatable. You're just looking to get the right numbers out. So yes, keep stirring the pile until you get something right, but don't ask too much about what the pile is or what you're stirring it with. And that's, you know, that's one of the problems we have. So here is a picture of a token space, and in it I've drawn this kind of imaginary surface. You could call it like a regulatory boundary function. This is just like some random equation, not meant to represent anything in reality. It's actually a really bad surface, but this is what I drew. And so the idea being that you can kind of, I mean, I wouldn't go as far as to draw lines in the sand here, but you can use this thing maybe almost to build kind of like traffic light kind of zones, or kind of like geological formations of like red, yellow and green zones, where you might have a green zone where everything looks pretty cool, a yellow zone where things are marginal, and a red zone where things don't look cool. And how you would frame those, the equations you would use and so on, that would depend on the particular regulator or compliance person or asset design or exchange that is building these particular things. So again, it's subjective, right? At least partially. And so here's a picture of a token space built in early 2018, about a year ago, so early 2019, using the top 10 assets, using based on the admittedly terrible metric of market capitalization. And so, excuse me, what we've got here is the same axes as before: securityness on the top, commodityness down here, and moneyness depthways. And so as you're increasing moneyness, for example, that means you're getting to a better money. As you increase the commodityness, you're getting a better commodity. As you increase the securityness, you're getting something that's more security-like. Now, I am not a regulator or a lawyer or anybody that knows anything about securities law or jurisdictions or even taxonomies. Like, I've got a PhD in physics, chemistry. I'm just trespassing. So don't take anything I say as some kind of important arbitration of truth. I'm just some guy, and my thoughts don't represent any employers or colleagues or collaborators that I may or may not be working with. So what you can kind of see here is like we saw with Phrygians don't slip on the ICO, you've kind of got a few different clusters. It seems like Bitcoin's kind of out on its own. That makes sense. It's got the first mover advantage, especially in terms of becoming a money. That seems to be quite important. Some people might talk about this in reference to the Lindy effect, the kind of silly cheesecake restaurant, if you read Taleb's books. ETH also seems to be kind of out on its own. It's more security-like than Bitcoin, but that's to be expected because they have a foundation which has a lot of funds. They have a lot of well-known founders. They did a token sale. So all these things make it look a bit more kind of regulatorily in that grey zone. Down here, you've got some proof-of-work coins, like Bitcoin-like proof-of-work coins, Bitcoin Cash and Litecoin. Now, these are also kind of like reasonable monies, I suppose. They're not as good as Bitcoin because they're not as widely accepted. They're reasonable commodities because they're like Bitcoin, but they're less widely accepted. They're more security-like because they've got these kind of famous individuals and well-funded groups and mining pools that control huge amounts of the computational resource, marshal huge amounts of the computational resource, and so on. USDT Tether didn't seem to be very well modeled by this framework, so it could probably do with improving. So here's a challenge to anybody that wants it, is to build a stable coin space or something like that could look at price dampened or less volatile assets. Over here we've got the kind of federated networks like XLM and XRP. They kind of look quite security-like, don't they? I wonder why that is. Maybe it's because all the tokens are controlled by insiders and all the nodes are run by kind of whitelisted servers and central entities and things like that. So I guess that could be the reason. Then you've got kind of like class of 2017 tokens up here. Not really going to talk about them too much for obvious reasons. So that's... Oh, and then let's jump forwards to the kind of abstracto ad absurdum. This is the model of everything with URL, combination, identity, identifier, addressing, indexing method, means an apparatus pattern. by Margaret Ronchet, whoever the hell that is, that came out in 2010. So Ronchet was also a Satoshi candidate, believe it or not, like not a very long-lived or serious one, but friends say that she was considered to be a candidate for Satoshi because you could kind of build Bitcoin using everything that's in this patent. To me, this seems like utmost trollery, patent trollery, where they're trying to patent literally everything so that everything infringes their patent of everything. So figure one, everything. Now, I understand this is kind of like an object-oriented ontology information system framework for a computer system, but you could build almost any kind of virtual digitized information system using what's in this framework. So I don't know how you use levels of abstraction like this to build a computer system. This looks a bit more like some kind of conspiracy theory, philosophy, psyche, green zone, hippie, Burning Man thing, which is fine by me, but I don't know how we can build computer systems with it. So yes, dimensions of everything, scope of everything, the entity ontologies, ontological integrations. Yeah, this just goes on and on and on. So anyway, that is a little bit of epistemporalism. I did it in 5 minutes at the salon, and it's taken me 50 minutes now. So lol at that. So if you're interested in the salon, we haven't got any events going on because of the quarantine, but 0xsalon.xyz, there's a whole bunch of stuff going on in our arena. We're quite interested in researching the topic of viral realism at the moment. And for more on that, look up the hashtag on Twitter, viral realism. So until next time, bye-bye from us. Bye.